you omitted a 0 or a 1. So then what happens is these probabilities over here, this is probability 1/2, this is probability 1/2, are the probabilities that you see 0 and 1 respectively. Okay, so with probability, so basically what happens is you toss a fair coin. If it comes up heads, you see a 0. If it comes up tails, you see a 1. And then the arrows tell you what hidden state you go to next. So if you see a 0, A goes to A. If you see a 1, A goes to B. And then if you're in B, you always see a 1 and you go back to A. Okay, so that's a hidden, this is a special type of hidden Markov model. Oh, 1 second. Sorry, I can't get it to escape. It's like not.
Oh no. Okay. But the mouse is just hidden. You have to guess where it is.
Yeah, sometimes I can just get it to escape and then. Okay, worked. So,
Yeah, well, actually, so
Yeah.
just to clarify the notation, the probability of transitioning is the first number and the current state is the second number.
the probability of transitioning, or I call the probability of emission, but in this diagram, they're the exact same thing. So probability of emission is the first number. The thing you see is the second number, and then the hidden state that you're in is in the bubble. Okay, so we're gonna play a game now. So I'm gonna do a version of a cognitive science experiment on you guys. So let's say that somebody said, well, I'm not gonna tell you which hidden state I started in, but I started in one of these hidden states. And I generated the following symbols. First, I generated 2 zeros, then I generated 3 ones, and they asked you to predict for some amount of money what happens next. Okay, so think about what you would predict. You can either predict a 0 or a 1. So think about what you would predict for like the next 10 seconds. Okay, now close your eyes. Raise your hand if you would predict a 0. Okay, good. Raise your hand if you would predict 1. Great. And I don't think anybody doesn't know what they would predict, but raise your hand if you're not really sure. Okay, so sure, there's some overlap. Okay, so everybody open your eyes. So it's actually an even split between zeros and ones. So can somebody who predicted a 0 explain why they would predict a 0? Yeah.
Because I thought that if you were, since the last state was 1, and this says, oh, if you are in 1, you have a probability of 1 of remission would go back to A, which would give you a 0.
Okay, so here you're saying if you're in state 1, so I would say if it's you see a 1 rather than you're in state 1.
Okay.
But okay, but let me try to translate your answer. So you see a 1, you have a probability of emission 1 to go back to A, and therefore you are probably in hidden state A, and therefore you should guess a 0. Is that what you're thinking? Okay. Can somebody who would say 1 explain why they said 1? Yeah.
I think there's no reason because 0, 0 is in A, and 1 actually from A comes to B, comes to A and comes to B. So I think the next time you observe 1 because of 1 probability is 1.
Okay, yeah. So both of you are correct in the way you're approaching this problem, which is you have to figure out what the hidden state is. Once you figure out what the hidden state is, you know exactly how you should predict. So basically, once we figure out what the hidden state is, all we have to do is trace our way through this hidden state diagram to figure out what hidden state we end up in, and that will tell us what to predict. So if we see 2 zeros, this arrow can only come from an A, so we must be in hidden state A. And then let's trace it. We see 1, 1, 1. That means we must be in hidden state B, and then you're completely right to predict a 1 because if you're in hidden state B, you can only see a 1. Okay, but good. Okay, so we do a version of this cognitive science experiment where we don't show them the hidden Markov model, and we'll get to that in a bit. But basically, this is a special type of hidden Markov model that actually allows you to trace through the hidden states and keep on following exactly what hidden state you're in. So you're sort of synchronized to what's going on internally. And that's what makes this an epsilon machine rather than some other type of hidden Markov model. So I'll show you an example of a, yeah, I'll show you an example of something that's non-epsilon machine. Oh my God, everything's breaking. I am using enhanced encryption. Oh.
pushing enter get you to the next slide?
It's broken, guys. I'm just gonna have to give the talk from memory. I think this is gonna be okay. So I'm just gonna start drawing. Oh, can you figure this out? While I
Yes.
just, is there a
Oh, yeah, I can
blackboard that I can work with? Is there maybe? Oh, good. I think I can work for it. Great. This will be fun. Oh, no, there are people watching. Oh, no.
Here's a screen that.
Okay, can everybody see this, including the people who are on Zoom?
There's, I think. Well, there's this over here. Goes to that one.
Yeah.
It's definitely not gracefully.
So this is what we just saw. This is an axology. Okay, so it's a special type of hidden Markov model. It's called a unifilar hidden Markov model. And the idea is that if you know what state you're in and you know what symbol you see, you know what state you're in. So for example, if you're in state A and you see 0, you know you're in state A. If you're in state A, you see 1, you know you're in state B. And if you're in a B and you see 1, you go to state A. That's the unifilar hidden Markov model. Here's an example of a non-unifilar hidden Markov model. Okay, good. All right, thank you. So here's an example of a non-unifilar hidden Markov model. Sorry, Michael. And the reason it's non-unifilar is if you're in hidden state A and you see a 0, you're not really sure what state you go to, right? So it could be that you flipped a coin and you saw, with probability P, you got heads, you saw 0 and you went to state A, or you flipped that coin, got tails, saw 0 and went to state B, you just don't know. Okay, so if we're going to play the same game again, how are we supposed to predict what happens next? So really what you want to know is you want to know what hidden state you're in, but here's the problem. If we see a 1, we know we're in state A. So a 1 is going to be a great symbol, right? 1 means that we've synced up to the hidden state and we're able to predict as well as possible. But once we see a 1, if we see a 0, we're not really sure what state we're in. We could be in state A, we could be in state B. So in order to predict as well as possible, you have to do this complicated thing in your head, which is basically predict the probability that you're in state A and the probability that you're in state B. And as you see more zeros, the probability keeps on changing. So imagine you're in state, you see a 1, you know you're in state A, and then you see a 0, and you could be in state A or state B. You see another 0, it's more likely you're in state B, but you have to keep track of exactly how much more likely. You see another 0 and this keeps on going. And so there's a fancy term for this, and this is called the mixed state presentation. So this is called a minimal generative model, meaning that it generates something in a minimal way with the minimal number of states necessary. But you can use this mixed state presentation to turn it into this epsilon machine, which is this minimal unifilar hidden Markov model. So it's the unifilar hidden Markov model that can generate the same thing with the minimal number of states. In this case, it's got an infinite number of states, and each of these states corresponds to keeping track of how many zeros you've seen since the last one. Okay, so this means you just saw 1. This means you just saw a 0 after seeing a 1, and so on and so forth. Okay, so hopefully it's starting to become clear why these epsilon machines are special for prediction. It's because these are the states that you can actually access from the data that tell you how you should build your prediction algorithm. Okay, so that's why we're using it for what we're going to use it for. And I'll show you a particular use of them that I thought was really cool. And so before I show you that use, I'm going to introduce to you this diagram. On the x-axis, you have memory. On the y-axis, you have prediction. And the memory is going to be given by this thing that I'll describe in a moment. Prediction is going to be given by this thing I'll describe in a moment. But basically, we're going to split memory, this diagram, to 2 regions. One region is going to be allowed. There's going to be some sensor somewhere that could have this combination of memory and prediction. And then there's going to be a forbidden region. There's no sensor anywhere that could have this combination of memory and prediction. And there's a line that separates the 2. It's going to be called the predictive rate distortion curve. And in this particular case, it would be the predictive information curve. So let's go into what memory is going to be quantified using and what prediction is going to be quantified using. And these are not, of course, the only ways to quantify memory and prediction, but they happen to be very conceptually nice and pretty useful. And so what we're going to do is we're going to basically look at a generalized correlation coefficient between whatever our sensor is doing and the past of the input. So this X with a funny arrow over it is supposed to be the past of whatever you're seeing. This R is the state of the sensor in the present. And so the mutual information between the two is going to be the memory. This is how much does the present sensor state remember about the past of what the input has shown it. And then prediction power over here is going to be that correlation between the present sensor state and what's going to happen in the future to the input. And we're dealing with a case of no feedback for the entirety of the talk. Okay, so yes.
What exactly is the line? What's separating the blue from the red?
Yeah, okay. So this line, so we've got allowed combinations of memory and prediction. So you can have 5 bits of memory and 1 bit of prediction. There is some sensor somewhere that can do that. For example, that may not always be true, but for this particular example, let's pretend it's true. However, due to the data processing inequality, it's absolutely impossible to have 5 bits of prediction and 1 bit of memory. Literally impossible. And so there's a region of allowed sensors, a region of allowed combinations of memory and prediction, and a region of forbidden. This line right here is going to be called the predictive information curve, and it separates the two. And so what you can do to figure out if something is a good sensor is you can see how close is it to the line. So if you measure something's memory and prediction to be over here, it's close to this line, it's efficiently predicting. However, if you measure something's memory and prediction and you put it over here, it's not really close to the line, it's not really an efficient predictor.
So it's just subjectively at this point.
It's just subjectively at this point, yeah. And there's going to be an example of a graph where I would actually really appreciate your take on this later, where it's actually in that nether region where it's not really clear what subjectively you should think. Yeah.
Just to clarify the flow of information, X is the input to the sensor, which has
Yes.
memory, and
Yes.
R is the output of the sensor.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's right. Yeah. Okay. So you might have guessed the problem already just staring at the slide a little bit, which is how do you actually compute this predictive information curve? We've got a semi-infinite future here and a semi-infinite past. So this seems like a little bit of a hard computational problem. And indeed, I can write this all down mathematically and it looks really nice. So for example, if I were to write this down mathematically, this predictive information curve, what would it look like? Well, you constrain the conditional probability distribution of sensor states given past the input such that the memory is less than or equal to R so that you maximize the predictive power. And this I of R gives you exactly what this predictive information curve is. You can turn this constrained optimization problem into an unconstrained one. This is a Lagrange multiplier. This right here is where the causal states are. They have minimal memory and maximal prediction. Minimal memory required for maximal prediction. So you can't have less memory than this and get to maximal predictive power. So that's why they're special. So this is all very well and good, but if you actually want to calculate something, which Suzanne Still and Chris Ellison and Jim Crutchfield did at some point in the past, and I should, this is not the right reference for this, but what they did was they said, well, we can't use the semi-infinite future and past, but what we can do is look at finite length approximations. So they looked at pasts of length L, futures of length L prime, and they started computing these predictive information curves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this epsilon machine right here, which we just played around with. It's relatively simple. It's a 2-state hidden Markov model. You wouldn't think it would be too complicated. However, this hidden Markov model right here does generate an infinite order Markov process technically. And the reason for that is that there is a past of all ones that confuses you and doesn't tell you which state you're in. And so if you start with L is equal to L prime is equal to 2 and you start computing predictive information curves approximately, you get this for L is equal to L prime is equal to 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you're not getting up to what the correct answer is. How do I know that? Well, we know that causal states lie on this line somewhere, and causal states are up here. So we're not even getting close. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed it. What is L and L prime again?
Yeah, so basically somebody said, well, we can't compute this, we're going to compute something else.
Okay.
And then they said, we're going to look at passive length L and use those to tell us about futures of length L prime.
The purple has the longest L.
Yep, that's right. That's right. I just basically did a march up from 2 in increments of 1. Yeah. Oh yeah, this E stands for excess entropy. It has a special name. So this E corresponds to the maximal predictive power that you can get. It's the mutual information between the past and the future. It's right at the limit. That's right. So causal states have this also has a special name. This is called the statistical complexity. This is called the excess entropy. They both have been proposed as measures of complexity to varying degrees. And I'm kind of mushing that up a little bit because that's not quite true, but it's close enough to true that I'm comfortable saying it.
And that can use something specific for the change you're putting in.
Yeah, it's specific. So these two values and all these curves are specific to this particular hidden Markov model. If I change this hidden Markov model, all these curves are going to change. Okay, so we then developed, so we knew that we weren't getting the right answer. And so we developed a way to actually get at semi-infinite past and semi-infinite future. So here we're taking a semi-infinite past, like literally a semi-infinite past, squeezing it through bottleneck to try to retain information about a semi-infinite future. And there's a theorem that we came up with. And basically it turns out that you can replace the semi-infinite past with these causal states. Okay, so remember the semi-infinite past is infinite. It's hard to deal with computationally as a result. And that's an understatement, but the number of hidden states is 2. And likewise, we can take a semi-infinite future and replace it with what's called a reverse time causal state that I don't have time to go into, but it turns out there are only 2 reverse time causal states. And there is an algorithm for getting the joint probability distribution of these two, the 4 time causal states and the reverse time causal states. And so you can actually analytically nail this curve when before it was impossible to compute. Now, of course, you could say, well, we could have gone to higher and higher LNL prime, but you encounter a curse of dimensionality that gets worse and worse for more and more complicated hidden Markov models. And the reason for that is that as you increase LNL prime, the number of trajectories that you have to deal with grows exponentially. So you have a hard computational problem there. So this turned out to be very useful for computing these predictive information curves. Yeah.
Throughout this experiment, your number of states is still 2, right? Not
That's right.
5.
That's right. Yeah, so you can think about L as giving you order R Markov approximations to the hidden Markov model if you want to. So there's sort of like an approximating machine that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and that gets exponentially bigger and bigger and bigger, but never actually gets there.
Sorry, maybe I missed this part, but like, what's the hat there in the arrows?
Oh yeah, sorry. So these halves correspond to the probability emission. So this is with probability half I'm at a 0, with probability a half I'm at a 1, if I'm in state A.
And B, I am forced to go back to A.
That's right. B, you're forced to go back to A. Okay, so let's talk about how we're supposed to compute these predictive information curves. So basically what we did was we said, well, before people were taking their machine, they were generating data from it, and they were going directly from the data to these predictive information curves, but there was a curse of dimensionality associated with that. And so what we're doing is we're saying, well, if we first infer an epsilon machine, or this special type of hidden Markov model is really all it is, we can go straight to these predictive information curves. And better yet, for the experiments I'm going to show you, if you know what you use to generate the stimulus, you can go straight from the machine to the predictive information curves. And you don't need to think about the sequence data at all. You don't need to generate it. You don't need to encounter the curse of dimensionality. You can just get the predictive information curves. So here are the questions that we're going to try to answer in this talk now that we have this technology working for us. So the first one is, do cultured neurons predict naturalistic input efficiently? This is a collaboration with Joost at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. The next one is, do humans predict artificial sensory input efficiently? And this is a collaboration with Vanessa Ferdinand at the University of Melbourne, who's a cognitive scientist. And then in simulation studies, which is a collaboration with Jim Crutchfield, we're going to talk about artificial neural networks. Okay, so first we're going to talk about neurons. What is this? This is a multi-electrode array. You can see a close-up here. These are the electrodes, and then you can see the neurons. And these are the activities that you record for them, and it's basically 1 neuron per electrode. You can see pretty clearly. There's a spike sorting algorithm involved. I'm not going to get into that, but all I'm going to tell you is that one of these channels corresponds to the stimulus. So what we do is we monkey with one of the electrodes, and we use it to generate a stimulus for all the other electrodes. And so the stimulus is channel 1 up here, and the other 59 electrode channels correspond to our readout, what the sensor is doing. Okay, so here's the paper that inspired us. They didn't do culture neurons. What this paper did was they looked at a salamander fish retina. They popped it out, they put it on a multi-electrode array, and they showed it this position of a bar as a function of time, and they recorded from a bunch of cells. And their question was essentially the same question that we're going to ask, which is, do the neurons in the salamander fish retina predict efficiently? So the question is, here's the activity of the neurons as a function of time. This is like the present sensor state. How well does it do at predicting the future input, which is the future position of the bar? Given that it has some sort of memory of the past, of the future bar, of the past bar position. And what you see on this figure is exactly the memory and the predictive power. And this right here is the predictive information curve. And all these dots correspond to, they took random groups of neurons and they calculated from the data, the memory and the predictive power, and they put them on this diagram. And what you can see is that basically all the dots are pretty close to the line. I know it's subjective and I'm happy to get into that more. And I would love to hear your thoughts on it because I don't really have a good answer for how to really objectively determine what close is or how close is close enough. But they're all pretty close to the predictive information curve. So from this graph, you could conclude, if you wanted to, that these neurons in the fish retina are efficiently predicting visual input.
Wait,
How complicated were the stimuli?
So this stimulus, if you're a physicist, this will be like sweet talk for you. This was generated by an overdamped Langevin equation. They also did, so they did more complicated input than that. The problem is with the more complicated input, they couldn't figure out how to get the predictive information curve. But with the overdamped Langevin equation, you know that you have something that is not infinite order Markov. You know you have Gaussian statistics. You can compute everything pretty easily. And then you had a question?
yes, is that, you said that it's predictive information curve?
Yes,
And is that the curve that separates the allowed from the forbidden?
that's right. That's right.
And so that's basically like a perfect predictor would be on that curve, right?
That's right. A completely efficient predictor would be on the curve. You'll also notice, by the way, that some of these points are above the curve, but that's just due to undersamplings. So ignore those.
Do you have, I mean, okay, just trying to, where would a random predictor be there?
Okay, that's a really good question. So they didn't think about where a random predictor would be, but what they did is they looked at the receptive fields that they got out of these neurons, and they looked at if this neuron were a generalized linear model, like where would the neurons lie? And they would lie something like here. I don't have this graph with me.
So how to predict this scheme? I don't get to how you.
Yeah, so okay, so is the part that's confusing how they got the predictive information curve or how they got the dots?
No, so when you get the dots, like, what's the-
Yes. Yeah, so what they did is they got it from data. So for example, this right here is basically how correlated is this with this, right? And so what they did is they looked at their data and they estimated the mutual information between this activity and this time in the future, the position of the bar at the time in the future. And there are good entropy estimators for dealing with this. So
So how's the,
Yeah.
how's the predictive horizon? Okay. How far ahead do you have to predict and how does it?
oh, that's a fantastic question also. So they basically played around with this delta t. What I'm showing you here is a particular delta t that I forget. And we could go back to the paper after the talk if you wanted to, maybe during T, and talk about what, but they also have, how does this predictive power here decay as a function of delta t? That is actually in their paper if you want to go read. So I would direct you to this paper, Palmer, PNAS 2015.
But it decays over time.
It decays over time. That's right. Yeah. Oh, wait, I think you've been raising your hand for a while.
So I'm going back, is that just the receptive field is decaying over time, or do you mean?
No,
memory
How
stuff?
far
this
ahead?
is yeah, this is a fundamental question. So like same receptive field, but like if you are asked to predict farther ahead in time, you're going to do worse because more things might have happened that you haven't observed. So it's sort of like if somebody asks you to predict what the stock price is going to be a millisecond from now, you could say, oh, it's basically going to be the same. But if they said a year from now, you're going to get it way off.
Right, okay. And these,
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So delta tau is this is also something we could talk about, but it's maybe less interesting and it has more to do with it. This is something that you just want to play around with and make sure your results are robust to. whereas this is like a fundamental quantity that maybe should be related to the time delay between perception and action or something like that.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask about, because these are sensory neurons, right? These are not the feedback difference type.
That's right.
factors coming with like cortical memory.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, you have to go on, but n is the number of cells, right?
That's right.
I'm wondering why with more cells, you have more bits in the past and in the future, that's one. And also, what are the different points? So let's say even for one specific n, what are the different points? Is it like different?
Yes. Okay. Let me answer the second question first. So for one specific n, what happens is they take that many neurons, but random choices of those neurons. So maybe they take neurons like 27, 34, and 35 for one group of three, but 16, 13, and 12 for another group of three. And that's how they get the different points. And then the reason that you see higher memory and higher predictive power for greater n is that the neurons are going to be picking up on some different aspects of the stimulus that give you different, like give you more information about the past and more information about the future.
How do you measure that?
Yeah, so it's just some complicated entropy estimator that correlates this with this. And we can talk about entropy estimators after this talk if you want to.
And that's of this external force, right?
That's right. That's right. Yes.
In this case, the number of cells is the number of dimensions.
In this case, the number of dimensions of the input, this is a one-dimensional thing. Number of cells tells you how many of these you're picking up, so it tells you the dimension of your sensor. Yeah.
Did you look at what the different cell types were or anything?
I don't remember her doing that in this paper. Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, well, we want to do the same thing, but for cultured neurons. And we want to get closer to something naturalistic. So in order to do that, first, I'll tell you about our attempts to do that. So naturalistic input is well known to have a power law power spectrum somewhere between 1/f and 1/f squared. This is from Dong and Attic. And so it turns out that these things called fractal renewal processes also have a power law power spectrum or something close to it. And in fact, so a fractal renewal process, all that means is that you have a point process and that the interstimulus intervals are drawn IID from some power law distribution. The power law coefficient tells you exactly what your power spectrum is going to be and also what your predictability is going to be. So if you remember, this is the excess entropy. It can shoot to infinity, it can go pretty low, but it can be all over the place. And so as you change the power law coefficient, you get very different behaviors. And we started out with a behavior that we thought was close to naturalistic. The problem with this, and by the way, it was close to a definition of interesting that Bill Bialik and Ilya Nemenman and Talay Tishby, RIP, came up with. The problem was that it led to such long mean interstimulus intervals that we didn't get good data for the experiment. So we had to change that a little bit, and we lowered the predictability so it was less complex, but still hopefully closer to naturalistic than maybe the overdamped Langevin equation was. Because of course, the power of having the technology that I introduced at the beginning is that we should be able to compute these predictive information curves for much more interesting stimuli. So that was our stimulus, yes.
So lower predictability just means a lower bandwidth if there's power spectrum, or no, this is
Yeah, this is a hard thing to interpret. So this right here is the mutual information between the past and the future of your stimulus. So yeah, it could be related to bandwidth if you have a Gaussian process. And so maybe that's a decent way to think about it. I would just say for this talk, think about it as if you have a higher mutual information between past and future, think about it as a more complex process. More interesting, more complex. Yeah, higher entropy, longer range temporal correlations. Alpha is the power law coefficient for the power law distribution describing the inner spike interval distribution.
So like, I know how to show a signal to retina. How would you show a signal to?
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, we're taking one of the electrodes and making it our stimulus.
Okay.
And so you can see this stimulus is spiking every so often.
Mhm.
And the time between the spikes is drawn from a power law distribution.
So this
Yeah.
electrode isn't like hooked up to one neuron, right? You're going to say whole population with this one.
I'm so sorry, I'm sick. Okay. So here are the results for exactly the same kind of analysis that Stephanie Palmer did. and Bill Bialik and a whole bunch of other people in that paper. Which is, here is the predictive information curve in gray. And then you can see that each of these is a random group of neurons, and you can see error bars from having 20 hours of stimulation to look at, which is a lot, but it doesn't get the error bars down to a decent size. So it kind of looks, based on these graphs, that what you're seeing is that these neurons are for some experiments really close to efficient and optimal. For some experiments, not really close to efficient and optimal. In some experiments, you're just like, wow, these, thank God for the error bars, otherwise I wouldn't trust the data. So I wouldn't take too much from this graph. But what Martina and Joost did over at the University of Twente is that for every experiment, they chose the best 5 neurons greedily. And then what we did is we put all of the experiments on one graph. So here's the prediction, here's the memory, and then all experiments are on this graph. And what you can see is that we're pretty close to the predictive information curve overall. So also for cultured neurons, we're seeing that we are getting pretty good efficient prediction. Okay, now into the part that is still in progress, as is what I just showed you. Yeah.
Earlier you said it, but like, what was the difference between the efficient and the optimal? It was the length.
So I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that question, actually. So can you?
I remember at some point you said that you limited it by L and L prime, and now you have like this. I think I have two curves, one for efficient prediction and other for optimal prediction. I'm wondering if the efficient one is the one that is bounded by L. Is that what it is? Or
Okay. Yeah, no. So other people had the problems with L and L prime, and then in this slide, Jim and I solved those problems. So efficient and optimal are the exact same thing. It's how close are you to this curve right here.
Okay. And when are they different?
And sorry,
When do they become different?
I don't remember saying that optimal and efficient were different, so I can't tell you.
Yeah,
No, my bad. I'm sure I said it, but I just can't remember in what context. Yeah.
In the previous curve that you showed just before this, it must be one of these is that efficient / optimal information, but what's the second one?
Yeah, good question. I didn't go into that, but basically this is how well could linear leaky integrate and fire neurons do.
So that's like a baseline.
Yeah, it's a baseline. Yeah, and
I think I know what it was. Like when you have these two curves, is the efficient / optimal, which I guess are the same?
Yeah.
Should they be one of the power laws specifically or not? Because one of them, it seems that one of those is like 1 over W and the other 1 over W squared, right?
no, okay, good question. Okay, so this right here is the predictive information curve for exactly the stimulus we used. And so the stimulus we used actually had some power law. I think it's like a 1 over F power law, power spectrum, or something close to it. And this right here corresponds to how well linear leaky integrate and fire neurons can do. So it's not related to, so you might think that this is like, oh, this is what 1 over F does, this is what 1 over F squared does, but no. This right here is what the optimal is for exactly the stimulus we used. And this is how well, suboptimal neurons would do.
I see. So if you did you try with like a more complex and exponential linear integrated fire?
Unfortunately, this is a 3-year grant. We're on year 3. We are out of time. Yeah. So very practical answer. Anyway, but this is sort of the takeaway slide. So it turns out that for cultured neurons, are also near efficient and optimal. Yes.
How are these data points? These are just like, these are still related to the experiment you just showed, but
yes,
less error bars. So what's going on?
Yeah. So basically, I don't know why the error bars are less for these data points. That's a really good question. But basically, there's one data point for every single experiment, and the way that the neurons are chosen for these data points is that neurons are greedily added into the bucket as they most increase the predictive power. So this is like, if you wanted to choose neurons in the culture that did the best job at prediction, which neurons would you choose? And those are the neurons that we're putting on this graph.
It's like less noisy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm really excited about this. So we did a cognitive science experiment that's very much related to the cognitive science experiment I performed on you guys at the beginning of this. So again, what we did is we generated 0s and 1s from this epsilon machine and other epsilon machines, but the humans are not allowed to see the epsilon machine. So you guys were allowed to see the epsilon machine that generated the data. These human participants just see zeros and ones. So what they see is 0, they're asked to predict what happens next. They guess, then they're shown what actually happened, and they guess again, then they're shown what actually happened over and over and over again. And we get them to do this for hundreds of tries. And they're asked to do it for as long as they can possibly stand. And then it can get us like 500. I was shocked. Oh, and you'll see here. Yeah, so basically this is the number of trials. You'll see how I actually got it wrong by like an order of magnitude. And what you see here is you see the cumulative accuracy. So it starts out high or low, that's just noise, it doesn't mean anything. But then what happens is it sort of settles down into what their accuracy was for that prediction strategy at that point in time. And then you can see that generally it increases, so they've learned to predict. And they do it for 3 different tasks. So this is called a clumpy epsilon machine. And this is supposed to be data that humans are relatively good at predicting. This is a noisy periodic 2 process. You can see why we call it that, because it's a periodic process, but there's a bit of noise in one of the variables. And then this is what's called the even process that we've been playing around with. And you can see that participants learn to predict from these cumulative accuracy scores. Yeah,
So is each curve a different participant?
that's right. Each curve is a different participant.
Some of them are just like chance accuracy.
Yeah, so right, this is chance, and this is the highest level you could possibly this is either the highest level you could possibly get, or it's the level at which they said keep on pressing for as long as you can.
It's interesting how the people who do best do it for the least time. Yeah, they got bored.
Yeah, I guess. I think this is, yeah.
The top performance thing.
They were asked to keep on doing it, so I don't know why they just didn't like us. Well, okay, so then we made these predictive rate distortion curves. These were rate accuracy curves. So this right here is the memory. This is the mutual information between what the participants guessed and the hidden state of the epsilon machine at that point in time, or really just the passive. It is supposed to be the past of the input we did, but we did the hidden state of the epsilon machine at that time. And this is the predictive accuracy. So this is not the same thing as the mutual information we've been talking about, but it's just whatever the predictive accuracy is. And you can see that this line separates forbidden from allowed. So this orange line is the equivalent of the predictive information curve. And these dots correspond to where the participants lie. And you can see that for the noisy periodic 2 process, they lie like straight on the line. Same thing for the even process. And then this, it's debatable, but they seem to be pretty efficient predictors of their input. Yeah.
Sorry, what is the rate represented right now?
Yeah, so the rate here is the mutual information between the hidden state of the epsilon machine at that point in time, the hidden state of what they're being shown, and their prediction, their guess. So it's basically like, what aspects of the hidden state are they using for making their prediction?
But it's okay.
It's called a rate, yeah. So, you know, it's in units of bits, but when you do rate distortion theory, it's bits per input symbol. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah. Anyway, and then we sort of asked, well, what is the mechanism by which they're doing so well? Because this right here and this right here was some pretty cool evidence that they were doing a really good job. So we sort of said, well, what are they actually doing? How are they doing it? And we came up with 4 potential ways that they might be doing it. Maybe they're learning like long short-term memory units. These are nearly state-of-the-art prediction algorithms. They're no longer state-of-the-art, but we were calculating log likelihoods based on the data that they were learning like LSTMs, and the log likelihoods strongly suggest that they were not compared to the log likelihoods of these other strategies. And then we said maybe they're learning like order R Markov modelers who are looking at the past R symbols, who are looking at patterns in R+1 symbols in order to make their guess. Maybe this is a very smart way of learning. So they could be learning like Bayesian structural inference machines. And what these people do is they would have a bag of epsilon machines, and they would look at their data and they would say, which epsilon machine best fits the data that I see? And then they would guess based on that epsilon machine. Okay, so that would be like if at the end of the experiment, they really could draw the hidden Markov model. Okay, that would be that. Or maybe they learn like generalized linear modelers who take a weighted average of the last case symbols and exponentiate and normalize to get the probability of seeing 0. So this would not be a particularly smart strategy, but it would be a statistical strategy where basically they say, well, I don't really know what's going on. I'm not going to really learn something about the structure, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something that statistically makes some sense. Then I'll get a better and better answer as I see more and more data. And we had a very talented undergraduate who now works at the Federal Reserve come in and calculate log likelihoods of everything so that we could choose the most likely one of these for every participant, for every experiment. And what we found out was that when we had this task right here, all of the people were order R Markov modelers. So all of them are looking for patterns in R+1 symbols and using those to predict what happens next. Same thing for the even process. All of them are looking for patterns in R+1 symbols and using those to predict what happens next. And then you see this interesting split here for the noisy periodic process. About an even number of equal number of people are order R Markov modelers and generalized linear modelers. And some group of people are being these really smart people who sort of search for exactly what epsilon machine to use and use that to predict. Yes.
Sorry, what is the y-axis? Is it percentage split or is it the actual log likelihood?
This is the number of participants in that experiment that had that strategy. So these are, so for example, in this experiment, there were, 37, 38 participants, and all of them were order R Markov modelers.
And how do you conclude that they had that strategy?
Yeah, I'll go back. So we calculated the log likelihoods based on the data, which is what we showed them and what they guessed. And based on that, we tried to calculate the log likelihood of them being LSTMs, of them being order R Markov modelers, of them being Bayesian structural inference machines, and generalized linear modelers. And then amongst these four.
Okay.
Yeah. And of course, this brings us to the possibility that we might not have, a possibility that they are actually using. There could be a strategy that they're using that we're not accounting for. But it seems like order R Markov modeler is really taking the cake. Yes.
The LSTMs, 2 questions.
Yeah.
So the output probably is like a softmax or something that people probably do so you can calculate log like.
Yeah.
Okay, second one, how do you, does the initial weights affect the?
Yes. Yeah, we played around with them and basically it affects it, but not to such a great extent that it changes any of the answers qualitatively. So for example, it will change a log likelihood from like -230 to -229 when all the other ones are sitting at -80. Yeah. Good question. Okay. So that was the human experiment. And now let's go on to artificial neural networks. And basically we showed reservoir computers, LSTMs, and things that are a simpler version of these. We showed them 5,000 data points from epsilon machines. And we asked, how well are you actually predicting these epsilon machines? So here is the rate. For those of you in the audience who know information theory, here's sort of the setup. So usually we just think input goes to a recurrent neural network. This arrow shows that it's recurrent. So the previous state depends on, the next state depends on the previous state. And this produces a prediction. We're going to imagine that this prediction is then sent through a channel and that this channel has a certain capacity. And we want to sort of map out how that, as we change the capacity, how capacity and accuracy relate to each other. And there's an entire rate distortion thing I could go into that I'm just not going to get into, but we're just going to imagine that this places another constraint on what we're doing. That allows us to use all the stuff all the technology that we started with in this presentation. And if we have this if we have this epsilon machine right here, this is exactly the predictive rate accuracy curve that we've been talking about. This rate over here is the mutual information between the output, the prediction that's being sent over the channel, and the hidden state of the epsilon machine. This right here is the predictive accuracy. And you can see we have a generalized linear model. We have reservoirs and we have LSTMs, and some of them are closer than others to being optimal. But even for this simple epsilon machine, we can see that they're not exactly as close as they could be. So this might be a little bit surprising because these are such simple things. You'd think that all of these machine learning strategies would nail it, but some of them are, they have a little more memory than you would expect, and they aren't maxing out the accuracy in the way that they would need to in order to be optimal. This is basically, by the way, I've chosen epsilon machines on which they do badly, so these are a little bit cherry picked. So this is another epsilon machine on which they did badly. These were sort of randomly sampled from a set of, from a very large set of epsilon machines. And you can see how the performance of these machine learners, they're not super impressive, again, partly because this is cherry picked. But then what we did is we surveyed the performance of all of these, the generalized linear modelers, the reservoirs, and the LSTMs over all these epsilon machines. And what we got are these histograms. So there are two ways that we're measuring their performance. One way of measuring the performance was to look how close it was to maximal accuracy. And this was called predictive distortion. The other way of measuring the performance was to look how close it was to the predictive rate accuracy curve. And so, for example, over here, it's right on the predictive rate accuracy curve. So this would have a high predictive distortion, but a low distance from the predictive rate accuracy curve. Yes.
This is probably because I don't know much about distortion theory, but so it seems that we have in this plot a high rate, so basically high mutual information between the hidden states and the participant choices,
Yes.
but still an accuracy that's much lower than the
Yep.
optimal.
Yep.
How come? Like how?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So basically what's going on is that they're picking up information that is not that useful for prediction. So some of these states are more useful for prediction than others. So for example, if you're in state C, this is incredibly useful for prediction, right? Because if you know it, if you know that you're in state C, you know exactly what's going to happen next. It's going to be a 0. But if you are in state B, it's not really clear what's going to happen next. So you can imagine that there's sort of a hierarchy of these states in the machine. That state C, if you had to choose which state you would pick up on first, you would pick up on state C first, and then you would pick up on state A, and then you would pick up on state B. And so this hierarchy means that if the generalized linear modeler picks up on state B first, and then picks up on state A, and then picks up on state C, they've done it wrong.
You can know which ones they actually.
Yeah.
develop.
Yeah.
And the goal of your channel modeling is just to deteriorate the software with good, or how does that play into this plot?
Yeah, so let me see if I can do this. So imagine that there's a rate associated with this, and imagine that there's an accuracy associated with the prediction too. So when it makes this prediction, it's doing it at some rate, which has to do with no, I'm not going to do this here. No, talk to me afterwards. I'll draw you a diagram and go through the entire thing, but this is not the presentation for it, and I really apologize for that. And what you see here is that on the normalized predictive distortion, the LSTMs are actually not doing so hot. So if you look over the survey of all the epsilon machines, the GLMs and the reservoirs are beating the LSTMs, but the LSTMs are fantastic at efficiently predicting. So they are close to that line, but they are not actually maxing out the predictive power. And how much time do I have left? No, actually, how much time do I have left?
10 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so I will zoom through this. No, that's a bad idea. I'm going to go straight to the end. Okay, so can we develop a fast way to compute seemingly uncomputable quantities like the mutual information between the sensor state and the entire future of the input? And we can, but we need these causal states. So I hope that if nothing else, I've managed to convince you that these epsilon machines and these causal states are useful for computing things like the predictive information curve and the predictive rate accuracy curve, predictive distortion functions that we could have gone into more. I hope I've convinced you that neurons and humans look to be efficient predictors, and artificial neural networks can or cannot be efficient predictors. It depends, and LSTMs do an excellent job of this. And if you are in the audience and you have experiments where you're interested in whether or not the thing that you're studying is predicting well, come talk to me. It probably is very easy to set up an experiment where we can test whether or not what you're studying is predicting well. And I wanted to acknowledge everybody here, so you'll see them on the slide. Vanessa Ferdinand and Joost. Hal is a great program manager. Martina and Shivan have been wonderful to work with. I really want to pay homage to the people in the second bullet point here, Jim Crutchfield, Stand Still, Stephanie Palmer, and Tony Bell for giving me a lot of ideas. And I want to thank all the funding sources as I did these experiments.
We looked at all two state, everything you were presenting was two output. Either zero.
Yeah, it was just binary alphabet. We could have done more, and that has been enumerated, but there was no need. Yeah.
So for the spikes, it was just like if in the delta tau, there was a spike or not. Is that what it is?
Yep.
So on the causal states you mentioned on the conclusion, you just mean how many states your hidden Markov model derived epsilon machine has?
Yes.
But, okay, excuse my naivety here, I'm really new to Markov modeling, but isn't the goal there to just ignore your past input and sort of disguise that into a state of the hidden Markov model in the first?
That's exactly what, yeah, can you repeat your question maybe differently? Because I agreed with what you just said.
Sure. So I think my question is, how is this, well, this is really me being very naive. How is this different from having just a genetic Markov model, not use its input, like the history of its input to predict the past? Isn't the goal of all Markov models to sort of get rid of like the whole chain of input and just rely on the current state to
Yeah.
the next state? So isn't this conclusion just reaffirming what the Markov modeling really does?
Yeah, but let's talk about these. So let's talk about these hidden Markov models a little bit differently by going back to this slide right here. So basically, these are both hidden Markov models where these states have the Markov property. If you know it's, like you are trying to shove all the information about the past into whether or not it's A or B.
Right, into the state itself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but these epsilon machines are special in that you can actually figure out if you're in state A or state B. So
But you need the pass for that.
which you need to pass for that.
And the causal states you're referring to would be which of these?
Yep.
Yep.
This might be the slide to answer a lot of people's questions.
And that really cool if you thought that you went by, like, on the last slides, just say what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll go straight to the conclusion of a lot of this stuff. So we looked at some really complicated epsilon machine input into various things. This is an example of what we looked at, these ion channels. And what we did is we looked at, we developed some closed form expressions so that we knew we were actually calculating things correctly. This was our actual input. It was, you could be in state A and then you see concentration XA with the dwell time of something drawn from this dwell time distribution. If you're in state B, you see concentration XB with the dwell time drawn from this distribution. And then we're going to have randomly drawn kinetic rates for very large random channels. So imagine a random channel in which there's a kinetic rate where you, for each of these concentrations, and the kinetic rate is drawn randomly, just completely randomly. And the channel has end states. What we see here is that this right here is the predictive information curve, and these are these large random channels and how well they do. So when your channel has 1,000 states, it tends to have exactly this memory, and exactly this predictive power. When your channel has, 1,000 states, this is like 10 states. I'm trying to remember, 10 states, 30 states, 100 states. I think I did something along those lines. And basically, you see a central limit theorem here working. So you might have imagined that all you need to do a good job at efficiently predicting is to increase the number of states of your system. However, what this shows is that if you're not careful about how you do that, some central limit theorem kicks in and it knocks you down to having a lot of memory and almost no predictive power. Yeah.
How many states do you think most ion channels have?
Well, yeah, I'm not gonna say more than 4. Yeah, so this was, this was a question I had, which was like, can you just do well with large random stuff? Because sometimes you can. Yeah.
What ion channels are the basis here? Are these cooked up channels? Are these biophysical channels?
They're cooked up channels, they're completely artificial. The biophysical channels had like 2 states. So I didn't put them in this presentation.
Well, I mean, there's 2 states when you're not binding other things to them or whatever, when you're taking them out of physiological environment.
You can have like a voltage gated calcium channel, which is typically a 4 state, which is why I said 4 was an optimal number. There's more channels.
I've seen like let's see, I've seen more than 4. I want to get into this and I want to play around with it because one of the research directions that I'm interested in is take a biophysical model. How close is it to the predictive information curve? So these are not biophysical things. I want to see how well a biophysical model does in relation to this, but
Are they optimal or not?
yeah, are they optimal or not? Yeah.
I think that 4 states, that whole thing, well, you have to look at-
Mm. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a little bit out of the, have you ever looked at the prediction in animals, like from like neural signals to their behavior? Okay.
No, I want to get into decision making though, so I probably will.
What other approaches do people take besides this quantify?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So first of all, like, should you use this and should you use this? Maybe or maybe not. There's things called, like, if you look at the reservoir computing literature, they have this thing called memory capacity, which is far easier to calculate. And then one of the things I did as a postdoc is develop the corresponding notion called predictive capacity or forecasting capacity. And you can replace this y-axis with that. So that's a totally fine thing to do. Probably you might ask yourself, why even use something related to memory? Maybe it's just a proxy for something else. So there's some other resource constraint or time constraint or something like that that you really want to put on the x-axis. Maybe there's another axis here, like they always talk about energy, speed, accuracy trade-offs. There's a lot of stuff you can do, really a lot. But I happen to like this because of something that I didn't get to go into, but if I had more time, I would talk about the rate distortion theorem and how it applies to what we're talking about here.
What are causal states?
Causal states are the hidden states of the epsilon machine. So for example, C, A, and B are all causal states of this epsilon machine right here, and they code for clusters of pasts. Yeah, also, I appreciate that you guys have sat through this entire thing because it's a lot of information being thrown at you.
This is
Oh, good. I'm glad.
So is there like a theoretical procedure, I'm sure there is, that you use to go from any Markov model to the epsilon?
Yeah, it's exactly on this slide. So I think, what's your name?
I can spell it out for you.
Okay, just give it to me.
Okay, it's up enough.
Up enough? Okay. This is called the mixed state presentation. This will take any hidden Markov model and turn it into the epsilon machine.
Okay, I guess I'll just look up if there's a library or something.
Yeah, I can actually send you my code. It's not great code, but I can send you my code if you want to use it.
Because I have these guys. This is the first one seen this side.
Yeah. No, there's this special thing. Basically, what happens is you you literally keep track of the probability distribution over the hidden states as you see symbols. You put them on the simplex, and then you draw transition probabilities and arrows between these probability distributions. So and then yeah.
Put that down.
They are weird functions. So this is some like complicated function of P and Q. and this is some complicated function of P and Q, but they actually have names. So one of these is a survival function, and I'm forgetting which one. And I think it's the W, and then this is the inter-event interval distribution. Intervent count distribution. They have names. Yeah. This is notice that this was 2015, so I've totally forgotten all the statistical wording associated with this. But yeah, this paper might be one to look into if you're interested in these kinds of things. They're associated with renewal processes. Thank you so much.
Any questions on the internet?